Picture this. You're standing in a colonial American home, watching a family boil the same water 5 times for different people to bathe in, using soap so harsh it could strip barn paint, and then wondering why everyone's skin looks like it lost a fight with a cheese grater. You're watching them stuff their mattresses with corn husks that attract every mouse within a 3-mile radius, then acting shocked when they wake up covered in bites. You're seeing them build houses with gaps wide enough to throw a cat through, then spending every winter morning wondering why their water bucket has frozen solid. Here's the thing that nobody talks about when we romanticize colonial America. These people weren't just dealing with hard times. They were actively making their lives harder through mistakes, misconceptions, and stubborn adherence to practices that ranged from merely ineffective to downright dangerous. And the wildest part, many of these errors were completely avoidable with knowledge they either ignored, forgot, or never bothered to learn from the indigenous peoples who'd been thriving on this land for thousands of years. Tonight, we're diving deep into the shocking reality of colonial incompetence. We're talking about medical practices that killed more people than they saved, hygiene habits that spread disease faster than gossip, building techniques that guaranteed misery, and food preservation methods that were basically Russian roulette with your digestive system. This isn't your grandfather's history lesson. This is the unfiltered truth about how our ancestors survived despite themselves, not because of their brilliant pioneer spirit. Before we jump in, if you're enjoying this deep dive into historical failure, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me which colonial mistake you think was the absolute worst, and whether you would have survived their spectacularly bad decision-making. Now settle in, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours exploring every misguided, dangerous, and face-palmingly obvious mistake that colonial Americans made on a daily basis. Part 1. The deadly myths of colonial medicine. Let's start with perhaps the most lethal category of colonial mistakes, their approach to medicine and health. Colonial Americans weren't just working with limited knowledge. They were actively embracing practices that modern medicine recognizes as catastrophically harmful, and they did it with absolute confidence. The bloodletting obsession stands as one of history's greatest medical disasters. Colonial doctors believed that most illnesses were caused by an imbalance of bodily humors, which sounds mystical because it was completely made up. Their solution? Remove blood until the patient either got better or died, which honestly seemed like a coin flip they were comfortable with. When someone had a fever, the doctor would arrive with his bleeding kit, make careful incisions, and drain pints of blood from a body already weakened by illness. The logic was that removing bad blood would cure the fever, when in reality they were just making patients weaker, more susceptible to infection, and significantly more likely to die from shock or blood loss. The truly horrifying part wasn't just that they did this, it was how enthusiastically and frequently they did it. Headache, bloodletting, stomach pain, more bloodletting, feeling weak and tired. Well, clearly you need to lose more blood. It's like trying to fix a leaky boat by drilling more holes in the bottom. George Washington himself was bled to death by his well-meaning physicians who removed nearly half his blood volume while treating what was probably a simple throat infection. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know about colonial medical practice, nothing will. Then there was purging, which was exactly as pleasant as it sounds. Colonial doctors believed that forcing violent vomiting and diarrhea would expel disease from the body. They'd administer mercury compounds, antimony, or other toxic substances specifically chosen for their ability to make you violently ill from both ends simultaneously. Patients would spend days racked with convulsions, dehydration, and cramping, all while their doctor nodded approvingly and said things like, "Excellent, the poison is leaving the body," when really they were just poisoning you differently. Mercury deserves its own special mention in the Hall of Colonial Medical Horrors. They used it for everything: syphilis treatment, teething pain in infants, general malaise, and even as a laxative. Mercury is, of course, incredibly toxic, causing brain damage, kidney failure, tooth loss, and tremors. But colonial doctors noticed that mercury made you salivate excessively, which they interpreted as the disease being expelled through your mouth rather than, you know, your body desperately trying to get rid of poison. Patients would lose their teeth, develop slurred speech, and experience personality changes, and the doctors would just prescribe more mercury because clearly the treatment was working. The mistake here wasn't just using these treatments once or twice, it was the absolute refusal to notice patterns. When 9 out of 10 bloodletting patients died, the colonial doctor didn't think maybe we should stop draining people's blood. They thought clearly we didn't bleed them enough, or the patient was too far gone when we started. This wasn't ignorance. This was willful blindness in the face of mounting evidence. Colonial Americans also made catastrophic mistakes with infection control, or rather, their complete absence of it. The concept of germs wouldn't be widely accepted for another century, but you didn't need to understand microscopic organisms to notice that reusing the same dirty bandages on multiple patients led to infections. You didn't need germ theory to observe that surgeons who washed their hands between patients had better outcomes. But colonial medical practitioners actively rejected these observations, claiming that a surgeon's blood-crusted coat was a badge of honor showing his experience rather than a biological weapon, endangering every patient he touched. Surgical instruments were rarely cleaned between patients. A doctor might perform an autopsy in the morning, wipe his tools on his already filthy coat, and then use those same instruments to deliver a baby in the afternoon, inadvertently introducing deadly bacteria into a vulnerable new mother. The resulting childbed fever killed countless women, and colonial doctors couldn't figure out why their maternity wards had higher death rates than home births. When a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis later proved that hand washing dramatically reduced mortality, he was mocked, rejected, and eventually driven mad by the medical establishment's refusal to believe him. The remedies themselves were often more dangerous than the diseases they claimed to treat. Colonial medicine cabinets were filled with compounds containing lead, arsenic, mercury, and other toxic heavy metals. Teething bobbies were given mercury-laced powders. Cough syrups contained opium in concentrations high enough to addict or kill. Patent medicines promised miracle cures but delivered addiction, organ damage, and death with cheerful efficiency. What makes these medical mistakes particularly frustrating is that better knowledge existed and was ignored. Indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated medical practices, including effective pain management, wound care, and herbal remedies that actually worked. Some colonists learned these techniques and used them successfully, but the medical establishment largely dismissed indigenous knowledge as primitive superstition, while enthusiastically embracing their own evidence-free bloodletting protocols. Colonial doctors also fundamentally misunderstood anatomy and physiology in ways that led to bizarre and harmful treatments. They believed that women's wombs could wander around inside their bodies causing hysteria, leading to treatments ranging from useless to traumatic. They thought that mental illness was caused by moral failing or demonic possession rather than physical brain conditions, resulting in treatments that were essentially torture disguised as medicine. The mistake wasn't just in their lack of knowledge. Every era has limited understanding. The real error was in their absolute certainty combined with their refusal to observe, question, and adapt. When treatments consistently failed, they blamed the patient's constitution or gods, rather than examining whether their methods might be flawed. This deadly combination of ignorance and arrogance cost countless lives. Part 2. Hygiene habits that spread disease. If colonial medicine was a disaster, their hygiene practices were the catastrophe that kept on giving. The irony is that many of their hygiene mistakes stemmed not from ignorance, but from deeply held beliefs about health that were completely backward. The Great Bathing Debate reveals one of colonial America's most dangerous misconceptions. Many colonists believed that bathing, especially in hot water, was actively dangerous to health. The theory went that hot baths opened your pores, allowing disease to enter your body, while the water itself could carry illness directly through your skin. So instead of regular bathing, they opted for what they called dry washing, changing their undergarments and occasionally wiping down with a cloth, while leaving actual bathing for once or twice a year if that. This wasn't poverty forcing them to skip baths. This was educated people, including doctors, actively discouraging bathing as a health measure. They'd publish pamphlets warning about the dangers of too frequent washing. They'd tell sick people to avoid water entirely. One popular medical text warned that bathing could cause sudden death, paralysis, or madness. The result was a population that rarely bathed, lived in close quarters, and spread disease with remarkable efficiency. The shared bathwater tradition made things exponentially worse. When families did bathe, they'd heat one large tub of water and have everyone use it in turn, from father to mother to children to servants, with the same increasingly filthy water. By the time the last person climbed in, they were essentially marinating in a bacterial soup containing everyone else's dirt, sweat, and shed skin cells. This practice guaranteed that any communicable skin condition would spread through the entire household. Their approach to laundry combined backbreaking labor with methods that often made clothes dirtier or damaged them beyond repair. The lye soap they used was so caustic that it degraded fabric fibers, meaning clothes wore out faster and needed replacing more often. They'd boil clothes for hours, which killed bacteria but also weakened the fabric and set stains permanently. Rinsing was often inadequate, leaving residual lye in the fabric that caused skin irritation and rashes. The truly baffling part was that they did laundry infrequently, sometimes going weeks between washings, which meant clothes accumulated layers of sweat, dirt, food stains, and bodily fluids. When they finally did wash, the combination of severely soiled garments and harsh soap created a scrubbing marathon that took all day and left their hands raw and bleeding. A simple weekly washing with milder methods would have been healthier, easier, and more effective, but they'd convinced themselves that this brutal quarterly approach was normal. Dental hygiene mistakes had cascading effects on overall health. While some colonists did attempt tooth cleaning with twigs or rough cloths, many believed that tooth decay was inevitable and untreatable. They'd live with abscessed teeth, gum disease, and oral infections that spread bacteria throughout their bodies, causing or worsening heart disease, joint problems, and systemic infections. The pain was constant, but they'd delay extraction as long as possible because the procedure was brutal and dangerous. When they did seek dental care, the treatments were often worse than the disease. Tooth extraction without anesthesia was common, performed by barbers or blacksmiths using tools designed for other purposes. The risk of infection was enormous, and many people developed life-threatening abscesses after extractions. They'd also attempt to fill cavities with lead, which poisoned them slowly while doing nothing to actually preserve the tooth. The colonial diet made dental problems worse. The omnipresent corn was tough and gritty, wearing down tooth enamel and getting stuck between teeth where it fermented and caused decay. Their bread was so hard it could chip teeth. They had access to foods that could have promoted dental health, crisp vegetables, certain nuts, fibrous fruits, but their preparation methods often eliminated these benefits by overcooking everything into mush. Hand washing was another area where colonial Americans failed spectacularly despite having access to water and soap. They'd handle raw meat, animal waste, and chamber pots, then prepare food without washing their hands. Midwives would attend multiple births without hand washing between patients. Doctors would go from autopsy to surgery without so much as a rinse. The result was rampant spread of dysentery, typhoid, and countless other fecal-oral transmitted diseases. What's particularly frustrating is that some colonists did notice the connection between cleanliness and health. Quaker communities, which emphasized cleanliness as a spiritual practice, had lower disease rates. Families who bathed regularly despite medical advice to the contrary stayed healthier. Indigenous peoples who the colonists encountered often had superior hygiene practices, including regular bathing and oral care. But instead of learning from these examples, most colonists dismissed them as coincidence or attributed better health to moral superiority or divine favor. The chamber pot system was a hygiene disaster waiting to happen every single night. Instead of making trips to the outhouse after dark, families kept chamber pots in their bedrooms that would be emptied in the morning. These pots were rarely cleaned thoroughly, creating permanent sources of bacterial contamination. They'd often spill or overflow during the night. The smell was overwhelming, and in crowded households with multiple people using the same pot, the bacterial load was staggering. The morning emptying ritual spread disease efficiently throughout the community. People would simply toss the contents out windows into the street or yard, where it would contaminate water sources, attract flies, and create permanent puddles of waste. In towns, the streets became open sewers. The connection between these waste disposal practices and waterborne diseases was observable but largely ignored. Their treatment of sick family members guaranteed disease transmission. Instead of isolating patients, they'd keep them in the family bed, surrounded by relatives who would inevitably catch whatever infectious disease was making the rounds. They'd use the same dishes, share towels, and provide intimate care without any barrier protection. When one family member got smallpox, measles, or influenza, it was almost guaranteed that everyone else would follow. Part 3. Housing Design Failures. Colonial housing represents a masterclass in how to make survival harder through poor design choices that were entirely preventable. These weren't limitations of available materials or technology. These were active decisions that prioritized speed or tradition over livability and safety. The gap-filled construction method was perhaps the most immediately obvious mistake. Colonists would build log cabins or board houses with visible gaps between the logs or planks, gaps large enough to see daylight through, large enough for mice to enter freely, large enough to create permanent drafts. They'd stuff these gaps with mud, moss, or rags as temporary chinking, which would dry out, fall out, or get pulled out by nesting animals. Every winter meant rechinking the same gaps, an endless cycle of maintenance that could have been avoided with better initial construction. The baffling part is that they knew how to build tight, weatherproof structures. Some colonial buildings were well sealed and properly insulated, but many settlers seemed to view gaps as acceptable or even necessary for ventilation, ignoring the fact that they were essentially heating the outdoors while freezing indoors. The amount of firewood wasted trying to heat poorly sealed homes was staggering, and the constant drafts contributed to respiratory illnesses and hypothermia. Foundation failures caused structural problems and pest infestations that plagued families for generations. Many colonial homes were built directly on the ground, or on inadequate stone foundations that shifted, settled, and allowed moisture to wick up into the wooden structure. This created perfect conditions for rot, mold, and termite damage while providing easy access for mice, rats, snakes, and insects. A proper raised foundation with good drainage would have prevented most of these problems, but many colonists couldn't be bothered with this extra initial effort. The resulting floor problems were inevitable. Dirt floors were common, which seems like a medieval throwback even by colonial standards. These floors were impossible to keep clean, harbored parasites, released moisture into the house, and turned muddy whenever water was spilled. The upgrade to wooden floors helped, but only if those floors were properly installed over a good foundation, which they often weren't. Floors would rot, sag, and develop gaps that became highways for vermin. Window design combined the worst of all possible choices. Real glass was expensive. So many colonial homes used oiled paper or thin animal membrane for windows. These materials let in some light while blocking most of it, creating dim interiors that strained eyes and made detailed work nearly impossible. They also degraded quickly, needed constant replacement, and provided almost no insulation. The windows were often too small to provide adequate ventilation in summer, but somehow still managed to leak cold air in winter. Even worse was the tendency to build too few windows, creating dark, poorly ventilated spaces that reeked of smoke, mildew, and unwashed humanity. The colonists seemed to believe that fewer windows meant better heat retention, ignoring the fact that adequate ventilation prevents moisture buildup, reduces indoor air pollution, and improves health. Some homes were so dark that people couldn't see properly indoors even at midday, yet they'd continue living this way rather than cutting a few additional window openings. The central fireplace design that dominated colonial homes was spectacularly inefficient. They'd build one massive fireplace that was supposed to heat the entire house, which meant the area directly in front of the hearth was uncomfortably hot, while everywhere else was freezing. The chimney design was often poor, leading to downdrafts that filled the house with smoke or inadequate draw that made starting fires difficult. Huge amounts of heat went straight up the chimney and out of the house. What makes this particularly frustrating is that more efficient heating methods existed and were ignored. Some European designs used ceramic tile stoves that radiated heat more effectively and used far less wood. Indigenous peoples had sophisticated understanding of passive solar heating and insulation, but most colonists stuck with the inefficient central fireplace design, cutting and hauling vastly more firewood than necessary and still shivering through the winter. The sleeping arrangements guaranteed poor sleep and disease transmission. Entire families would crowd into a single room, sometimes a single bed, creating perfect conditions for spreading illness and parasites. They could have built simple bedroom partitions or sleeping lofts with minimal additional effort and materials, but many didn't bother. The excuse was usually cost or time, but the long-term cost in health and comfort far exceeded any short-term savings. Roof design often prioritized aesthetics or tradition over functionality. Thatched roofs were beautiful but required constant maintenance, harbored vermin, were fire hazards, and leaked persistently. The transition to wooden shingles helped with some of these problems but created new ones. Poorly installed or low-quality shingles would warp, crack, and blow away, requiring constant replacement. The pitch of roofs was often inadequate for the local climate, leading to snow accumulation and collapse in northern colonies or poor rain drainage in southern ones. Attic spaces were typically underutilized and poorly designed. Instead of creating proper storage areas or additional sleeping spaces, most attics were just hot, dusty, bat-filled voids between the living space and the roof. They could have been designed to provide insulation, storage, and extra room, but instead they usually just harbored pests and radiated heat down in summer. Colonial home layouts often made basic tasks unnecessarily difficult. Kitchens were poorly planned, with awkward workflow that meant cooks had to traverse the entire room multiple times while preparing a single meal. Storage was inadequate or poorly placed. Doorways were positioned where they created maximum draft or traffic disruption. These weren't problems that required advanced knowledge to solve, just basic observation and planning that many colonists couldn't be bothered with. The lack of proper storage solutions meant food spoiled, clothes got musty, tools rusted, and valuables were damaged. Simple enclosed cabinets, raised shelves, and sealed containers would have prevented enormous waste, but many families just stacked things in corners or hung them from random pegs, creating cluttered, disorganized spaces that made finding anything a challenge. Basement and root cellar mistakes were equally problematic. When colonists did build these below-ground storage spaces, they often failed to provide adequate drainage, ventilation, or pest control. Root cellars would flood, produce would rot, and the humid environment would attract every pest imaginable. A properly designed root cellar with good drainage, air circulation, and pest barriers could keep vegetables fresh for months, but poorly built ones were basically expensive compost bins. Part 4. Catastrophic Food Mistakes. Colonial food preservation and preparation methods reveal a stunning capacity for turning adequate nutrition into dangerous gambles with food poisoning, malnutrition, and sometimes death. These weren't just inconveniences, they were serious mistakes that cost lives and health. The corn dependency was a slow-motion nutritional disaster. Colonists leaned heavily on corn because it was easy to grow and produced high yields, but they failed to adopt the critical preparation method that indigenous peoples had used for millennia: nixtamalization. This process of treating corn with alkaline solution made the nutrients, especially niacin, bioavailable. Without it, people who relied heavily on corn would develop pellagra, a devastating disease causing dermatitis, diarrhea, dementia, and death. What makes this mistake particularly inexcusable is that indigenous peoples tried to teach colonists the proper preparation method. They showed them how to process corn with wood ash or lime to make hominy and masa. But many colonists ignored this advice, viewing native practices as primitive rather than recognizing them as sophisticated food science developed over thousands of years. The result was predictable: widespread pellagra in communities that ate mostly corn, a completely preventable disease caused by stubborn refusal to learn. The endless cornmeal mush and Johnny cakes weren't just monotonous, they were nutritionally inadequate. Colonial families would eat corn for breakfast, lunch, and dinner in slightly different forms without the variety needed for basic nutrition. They had access to diverse foods: wild game, fish, varied vegetables, nuts, berries, but poor planning, limited preservation skills, and simple laziness meant they'd default to corn for most meals. Salt preservation methods, while necessary, were often done incorrectly in ways that made food dangerous rather than safe. The key to safe salt curing is using enough salt to prevent bacterial growth while storing the meat in conditions that don't promote spoilage. But many colonists would undersalt their meat to save money, or store it in warm, humid conditions where bacteria thrived despite the salt. The result was meat that tasted preserved, but was actually crawling with potentially deadly bacteria. Pork preservation was particularly problematic. Colonists loved their salt pork and bacon, but improper curing and storage meant these products often harbored trichinosis parasites, botulism bacteria, or were simply rancid. They'd eat this meat anyway, either because they didn't notice the spoilage or couldn't afford to waste food, leading to illness and sometimes death. Proper refrigeration was centuries away, but even without it, better salting techniques and cooler storage would have prevented most problems. The smoking process was often botched in ways that left meat vulnerable to spoilage while giving it a smoky flavor that masked the signs of decay. Colonists would assume that because meat was smoked, it was safe, ignoring the fact that inadequate smoking time, wrong wood choices, or poor airflow meant the meat was only superficially treated. They'd store poorly smoked meat and be surprised when it developed mold or went rancid. Pickling and preserving vegetables suffered from similar problems. The science of safe pickling requires sufficient acidity to prevent bacterial growth, but many colonial recipes used too little vinegar or depended on salt alone, creating conditions where dangerous bacteria could thrive. Botulism in pickled vegetables was common because people didn't understand that low-acid foods need specific processing to be safe. Home canning, when it became available toward the end of the colonial period, was even more dangerous because the stakes were higher. Improper canning creates perfect conditions for botulism, and many families learned this the hard way. They'd follow recipes that didn't provide adequate processing time or temperature, creating jars of what they thought was safe food, but was actually toxic. Milk handling was a disaster that unfolded fresh every day, without refrigeration or pasteurization. Milk spoiled quickly, but colonists would drink it anyway or use it in cooking despite obvious signs of souring. They'd leave milk sitting out for hours, then wonder why everyone got diarrhea. Some of this was unavoidable given the technology, but simple practices like keeping milk in cool spring houses or underground storage would have helped enormously. The butter and cheese making process was supposed to preserve milk, but when done incorrectly, it just created different types of spoiled dairy. Butter would go rancid within days if not properly worked and salted. Cheese would develop dangerous molds or fail to properly acidify, creating food poisoning risks. The colonists had access to correct techniques, again, often from indigenous peoples or European traditions, but many cut corners or improvised in ways that compromised safety. Bread-making mistakes ranged from merely unpleasant to actively dangerous. The hard tack-style bread that could double as a weapon wasn't just difficult to eat, it was nutritionally poor and hard on teeth. But colonists made it anyway because it stored well, ignoring the fact that slightly different recipes could produce bread that stored adequately while still being edible without risking dental damage. Yeast management was another area where ignorance led to problems. Colonists would keep starter cultures going for months or years, which sounds traditional and wholesome, until you realize that contaminated starters were common. Bad yeast could produce off flavors at best or cause illness at worst, but many families would just keep using the same starter because they didn't know better or couldn't be bothered to maintain it properly. Storage mistakes guaranteed food waste and sometimes food poisoning. Colonists would store different foods together without considering how they affected each other. Potatoes near onions, apples near vegetables that produced ethylene gas. They'd use containers that promoted spoilage or attracted pests. They'd fail to rotate stock, using fresh food while older supplies spoiled in the back of the storage area. The root cellar, when properly maintained, was an excellent storage solution, but many colonial root cellars were poorly managed. Temperature and humidity control were ignored. Ventilation was inadequate. Regular inspection for spoilage didn't happen. The result was that produce that should have lasted months would rot within weeks, and families would sometimes eat partially spoiled food rather than admit waste. Seasonal eating patterns, while partly forced by circumstance, were made worse by poor preservation planning. Colonists would gorge on fresh fruits and vegetables during summer, then subsist on nutritionally inadequate preserved foods during winter. Better preservation methods and planning could have provided more balanced nutrition year-round, but many families didn't bother with careful planning. The failure to learn and adopt indigenous food practices represents one of colonists' most consequential mistakes. Native peoples had developed sophisticated knowledge about which plants were edible, how to prepare them safely, seasonal harvesting patterns, and preservation methods suited to local conditions. Some colonists learned and benefited enormously, but many dismissed this knowledge and suffered preventable malnutrition and food poisoning as a result. Part 5. Social and Community Mistakes. Beyond the physical hardships colonists imposed on themselves, they made social and organizational mistakes that multiplied suffering and prevented communities from thriving. These errors reveal how cultural assumptions and rigid thinking made difficult lives even harder. The privacy paradox created unnecessary stress and conflict. Colonial homes were crowded with entire families sharing single rooms, yet the culture demanded strict modesty and privacy that was physically impossible to maintain. Instead of adapting social expectations to match reality, colonists maintained pretenses that created constant tension. People would try to change clothes under blankets, pretend not to notice when others used chamber pots, and maintain elaborate fictions about privacy that everyone knew were false. A more sensible approach would have been to acknowledge the reality of close quarters and adjust social expectations accordingly. Some cultures managed this successfully, developing customs that respected dignity without requiring impossible physical privacy. But colonial Americans clung to standards imported from larger European homes, creating shame and embarrassment over situations that were simply unavoidable. The gossip-driven social control system might seem quaint until you realize it destroyed lives and prevented communities from addressing real problems. Instead of handling disputes directly or establishing fair systems for conflict resolution, Colonial communities relied on rumor, innuendo, and public shamming. Reputations could be destroyed by whispers. People lived in constant fear of becoming subjects of gossip. The result was a culture of conformity and fear, rather than genuine community. This system was particularly cruel to women, whose reputations were fragile and whose behavior was constantly scrutinized. A woman could be ruined by rumors about her virtue, her housekeeping, her children's behavior, or simply being different from community norms. The witch trials represent this system at its most deadly, but the everyday cruelty of colonial gossip destroyed countless lives without ever reaching that extreme. The rigid gender roles prevented communities from utilizing everyone's full potential. Men were expected to handle certain tasks regardless of aptitude, while women were confined to domestic work even if they had talents and interests elsewhere. This meant that a woman with a gift for blacksmithing would be stuck churning butter, while a man with no aptitude for farming would struggle with agriculture simply because that's what men did. Some colonial communities did allow more flexibility, and these tended to thrive because they could adapt to circumstances and individual abilities. But many settlements clung to rigid roles that made survival harder and prevented people from contributing in ways that matched their abilities. The excuse was always tradition or propriety, but the cost was paid in reduced productivity and human potential. The treatment of children as small adults who should work constantly was both cruel and counterproductive. Childhood education and play aren't luxuries. They're how humans learn skills, develop creativity, and build cognitive abilities. Colonial children who spent all their time on repetitive chores never developed the problem-solving skills or broader knowledge that would have made them more capable adults. Communities that did value childhood education and allowed time for play tended to produce more innovative, adaptable adults. The Puritan focus on literacy, despite all their other faults, meant their children grew up with skills that served them throughout life. But many colonial families saw childhood only as a source of labor, creating a cycle where each generation was as limited as the last. The failure to learn from indigenous peoples represents perhaps the most consequential social mistake colonists made. Native Americans had deep knowledge of the land, climate, plants, animals, and sustainable practices developed over thousands of years. Some colonists learned and benefited enormously. Squanto's assistance to the Plymouth colony is well known precisely because it was so valuable. But most colonists approached indigenous peoples with a combination of fear, contempt, and willful ignorance that prevented learning. The assumption that European ways were automatically superior meant colonists often ignored or rejected knowledge that could have prevented suffering and death. They'd struggle with unfamiliar crops using European techniques when indigenous farming methods were better suited to local conditions. They'd get lost in forests where native peoples navigated easily. They'd starve surrounded by edible plants they didn't recognize, despite indigenous peoples trying to teach them. This wasn't just tragic, it was stupid. The colonists were newcomers to an environment that indigenous peoples understood intimately. The smart move would have been humble learning and adaptation, taking the best from both European and indigenous knowledge. Instead, cultural arrogance and racism prevented beneficial knowledge transfer that could have eased the colonial experience enormously. Community resource management often failed because of short-term thinking and tragedy of the commons problems. Shared pastures would be overgrazed, forests would be overharvested, fisheries would be depleted. Everyone acted in their immediate self-interest without considering long-term sustainability. And communities suffered as resources that could have provided for generations were exhausted in years. Some colonial communities did establish successful common resource management with rules about usage, rotation, and conservation. These communities tended to thrive over long periods, but many settlements failed to implement such systems until resources were already depleted. then wondered why their land became less productive over time. The legal and justice systems, with their emphasis on public humiliation and harsh physical punishment, were counterproductive to community harmony. The stocks, whipping posts, and public shamming might have deterred some crime, but they also created resentment, divided communities, and often punished people for victimless crimes or simple poverty. A person put in the stocks for debt wasn't going to be better able to pay afterward. They'd just be humiliated and angry. More restorative approaches to justice, focused on making victims whole and reintegrating offenders, existed in some cultures and worked better at maintaining community cohesion. But colonial justice was often more about asserting authority and conforming to rigid moral codes than actually solving problems or helping communities thrive. The marriage and family formation practices, while superficially practical, often created miserable unions that made life harder. Marriages were frequently arranged with minimal input from the participants, based on property and family alliances. While some of these marriages developed into genuine partnerships, many were lifelong sources of conflict and unhappiness. The refusal to allow divorce, except in extreme cases, meant people were trapped in abusive, dysfunctional, or simply incompatible marriages. The suffering this caused affected not just the couple but entire families and communities. Some flexibility in allowing people to separate and remarry would have reduced misery and allowed people to form more functional family units. Religious rigidity prevented communities from adapting and responding to new challenges. The insistence that there was one correct way to interpret Scripture, one proper form of worship, one acceptable moral code meant that communities couldn't adjust to changing circumstances or incorporate new ideas. Dissenters were expelled, creating new settlements rather than allowing diversity of thought within existing communities. This pattern repeated throughout colonial America, with each new religious splinter group establishing its own community and then dealing harshly with the next generation of dissenters. A more tolerant approach would have allowed communities to benefit from diverse perspectives and adapt more readily to challenges. The final mistake was the failure to question and adapt. Colonial Americans who succeeded were often those willing to learn, change, and adopt new practices when old ones didn't work. But many colonists clung stubbornly to familiar ways, insisting that if something worked in England or Germany, it must work in America, regardless of evidence to the contrary. This intellectual rigidity turned manageable challenges into crises and made survival harder than it needed to be. Conclusion. So here we are at the end of our journey through colonial American mistakes, and if there's one overwhelming theme, it's this. So much of their suffering was optional. The harsh climate, the unfamiliar environment, the distance from Europe, these were real challenges. But the deadly medicine, the disease-spreading hygiene, the poorly designed homes, the dangerous food practices, the rigid social structures, these were self-inflicted wounds. What makes these mistakes particularly frustrating is that better ways existed and were often known. Indigenous peoples had solutions to many problems colonists struggled with. Some European communities had developed more effective practices. Individual colonists figured out better methods and thrived. But knowledge existed in isolation, ignored or dismissed because of cultural assumptions, arrogance, or simple stubbornness. The colonists who succeeded weren't necessarily the toughest or most resourceful. They were often simply those willing to learn, adapt, and question conventional wisdom. The ones who listened to indigenous peoples,